everybody, welcome back to Polymath. My name is Dan, and today I'd like to talk to you about mental illness. And the concept of mental health and mental illness are probably things that you've heard of, and in recent decades it's started to hit the cultural mainstream. And that is a good thing, but it also means that there's been a massive proliferation of misinformation online. And you go online and there's a huge number of websites and podcasters and interviewees and all these different figures telling you about mental health and mental illness and what they are and what this means. And the fact is, the vast majority of this is non-scientific. It's not based in any actual science. It's just people giving their opinion. And if it's just people giving their opinion, it's worthless. It doesn't mean anything. So what I want to do is just take sort of academic information from the scientific fields of psychology, neuroscience, and clinical medicine, and I want to just popularize that academic information. I want to just integrate expert consensuses from all these different fields and communicate it to you. And I'm not trying to give you a hot take or an opinion. I just want to give you an actual scientific guide to mental health and mental illness because I think it's important. So the first really big question we have to ask is, what defines mental illness? So at what point does some kind of pattern of behavior or thoughts become a mental disorder? At what point is it abnormal? At what point does that deviate from just standard mental behavior? Standard mental processes. So that's really difficult to define actually, because one way that we could define a mental disorder is when you have a mental pattern, so thoughts or behaviors, whatever, that worsen health and well-being. But for example, engaging in drinking alcohol or engaging in smoking are things that worsen your health and well-being, but most people wouldn't classify drinking and smoking as mental disorders, or boxing and wrestling for that matter. So another way to characterize mental illness is the idea of deviance from social and cultural norms. So we say that any kind of mental behavior or mental thought pattern that is inappropriate or abnormal in the kind of social and cultural context can be classified as a mental disorder. But this also raises really big problems. So for example, homosexuality used to be classed as a mental illness in the before various decades ago, because in the social and cultural context in which homosexuality was recognized within the academic community as a mental illness, although of course there were dissenters to that mainstream opinion, at that context, homosexuality was seen as deviant and abnormal. Although of course we know now that homosexuality is in fact natural, and about 5% of people worldwide are homosexuals. And in fact, animals in lots of different species also display homosexuality. But the point is that at that point, homosexuality was a deviance from social and cultural norms. But that shouldn't make it a mental disorder. Another great example of this is hysteria, which was a diagnosis for stressed out women in the 1800s, which may be expected in a period where women had no basic civil or political rights and were completely subject to the authority of their husbands, and when domestic violence wasn't even a crime, or marital rape wasn't even a crime. Actually, what's interesting is that a practice in the 1800s would be women being committed to asylums as a result of protesting against the authority of male figures in their lives. So for example, their fathers or their husbands, because that was seen, female defiance of male authority at that time was seen as a deviance from social and cultural norms. So it was classed as a mental illness. But in reality, that probably isn't a mental illness. And in fact, the innate human desire to be free from arbitrary constraints and authority is in fact normal. So kleptomania, another really interesting is the diagnosis of kleptomania, because this was started about in the early 1900s, and most of the people diagnosed with kleptomania were upper class American women, because when upper class American women were engaged in stealing, it was conceptualized as a mental illness. However, when women from lower socioeconomic statuses were caught stealing, they weren't given a mental illness label, they were simply seen as criminals who needed to be arrested. So the idea of conceptualizing mental illness as a deviance from social and cultural norms also runs into a lot of problems. So another potential criterion we could have for mental illness is something that's unusual in the population. So we could say that maybe something that is clearly abnormal in terms of uncommonness, so rarity. That could be a criterion for mental illness. But actually, so a really big study by this researcher called Kessler and his team in 2005 showed that most people, or rather not most people, but many people experience a mental illness or mental disorder at some point in their lifetime. The point is that experience of mental diagnoses are actually way more common than you might think. And in fact, another study by Moffitt et al., so that just means a researcher called Moffitt and their team, in 2010, basically found that the diagnosis rates for anxiety, depression, alcohol dependence, and cannabis dependence were about 2 times what previous surveys in New Zealand indicated. So the point is that actually mental health diagnoses are not that much of a rarity. So all this really begs the question, if we have so much trouble deciding what is mental illness, what even makes a mental disorder? How do we define a mental disorder? That really begs the question, is all of this even real? Are we even measuring something underlying such as mental illness? So this really relates to the idea of, say, something like anxiety or depression. The emotion of anxiety and the emotional state of depression are in fact a basic repertoire on the range of human emotions. So anxiety and sadness are emotions that did in fact involve for certain reasons. And if you look at the population, everyone in the population will be on this sort of continuum, perhaps a bell curve, of people who are currently experiencing more anxiety or currently experiencing less anxiety. So some people in the population will be not anxious at all, some of them will be really anxious, most people will be somewhere in the middle. So you get this kind of bell curve distribution. The same with something like depression, right? And you might be thinking, well, people who are experiencing really high rates of anxiety or really high rates of depression might just be doing so because of the actual conditions that they live in. So it might not be that they have some kind of strange mental illness. They might just be living in certain bad conditions. So the argument being that diagnoses of mental illness and giving medications of mental illness shouldn't be done. Now, I think there is something to be said for that. It doesn't really seem logical that people who are still experiencing high levels of anxiety or depression shouldn't be given any kind of medical treatment at all, because we know that that helps. And even if it doesn't resolve the root cause of your symptoms, for example, if you're highly anxious because you're being domestically abused, for example, taking sertraline isn't going to change that situation, but it will help you deal with it whilst you deal with that situation. It doesn't make sense that we need to say to people, you need to change that situation, but while you're doing that, or if you can't do that, for example, if you're trapped in a domestically abusive relationship, that's just one example though, you're not able to have some kind of symptom relief. That doesn't really make sense. But actually, probably a better way of viewing it, so a better way of viewing things like anxiety or depression, is to view it as a continuum not of how much anxiety someone is currently experiencing, just to use that example, but people's propensity to anxiety. Because different people will have basic sort of predispositions to that experience of anxiety. So some people have a low propensity for anxiety. They won't experience anxiety very often at all, even if in very strong, stressful situations. Most people have a sort of middling propensity for anxiety, but some people have a very high propensity for anxiety. So they might experience anxiety even when the situation, most people would agree, isn't really that stressful. The anxiety response is disproportionate to the stressor. And that's due to various different reasons. There's lots of study on the genetics of mental disorders such as anxiety. I'm just using that because it's a really common example. And there's also evidence that in people's early experiences can actually genuinely change the structure and connectivity of your brain. So this might sound like a bit of a crazy concept, but actually it's really well established in research. When you go through stressful things in life, it genuinely changes the structure of your brain and the volume of certain areas in your brain. To give a really extreme example of this, if you have babies and you neglect them, so you don't give them basic touch, so touch and physical affection are really important. And when babies are deprived of physical affection, their pituitary glands in their brains won't secrete growth hormone. So the babies don't actually grow. So there's this really, really strong link between mind, body, and brain. And I talk about that more on another podcast that I've run called Understanding Happiness, Science, and the Buddha. But the point is, people with high propensity to anxiety are doing so because of inherent factors. For example, their genes, or their epigenetics, which is basically how those genes get expressed, and also their environmental experiences, which has led to changes in their brain structure. And for people like that, getting medical treatment is really, really necessary, because it might be that the situation of their life can be helped, stresses in their life can be reduced, but due to their high propensity for anxiety, they're still going to be experiencing anxiety. That's still something that you need to treat. That is still an actual mental disorder, some kind of mental problem that isn't just a reaction to the circumstances that people face. So, but the idea of mental illness traits as a continuum in general, even when there's questions about what that continuum is, for example, the emotional state of anxiety and the trait of anxiety, that propensity for anxiety, that metaphor is actually quite useful for lots of different mental disorders and also forms of neurodivergence. So something like ADHD or autism, for example. So I'll give an example. ADHD, No, I'll give another example actually. Psychosis. So schizophrenia is characterized by delusory beliefs. In part, there's actually schizophrenia, very complicated. I'm going to do another episode about it at some point. But schizophrenia, in part, is characterized by delusions. So cognitive distortions where people believe things that are unreasonable given the time or context. But everyone believes things that are unreasonable at some point. Like, that is actually a normal part of human functioning. However, different people, again in the population, will show different degrees of that kind of cognitive distortion. So, and again, some people will have very little of that, most people are somewhere in the middle, and some people will have really high degrees of that. And actually, at those really high levels, that is something that we might call a mental disorder, that we might call a mental illness. Now, where we put the cutoff, where we say, right, this is what separates the normal human experience from a disorder, that is inherently quite arbitrary, and there's a lot of controversy around that. But that's really a problem for all kind of mental disorders. So for anxiety, for example, when we talk about propensity to anxiety, people will naturally vary in their propensity to anxiety. However, at what point we then say, okay, this is a disorder, is actually going to be inherently quite arbitrary. Like, where do we draw the line on this bell curve? It's quite difficult. And we're going to explore that how different actual clinical manuals that are meant to be used in psychiatry, so in actual practice, kind of handle this problem differently. But that's just a good sort of theoretical basis to go on. So the idea that depression isn't real, for example, which is shared by some people, so the idea that depression isn't real is shared by some people on the basis that, well, depression, i.e. being sad, could just be like a standard response to life conditions. So this isn't something that we should be labeling, we shouldn't be giving a diagnosis, and we shouldn't be treating it with medicine, we should be encouraging it to change their lives. We should be encouraging people to change their lives. And while that's true, that's also a very reductionist approach, and it's also not a very empathetic approach, arguably, because whilst you could encourage someone to change the circumstances of their life, there's no reason why you wouldn't offer symptomatic relief in concordance with that. So, unsurprisingly, the view that depression isn't real or that mental illnesses aren't real are typically held by more right-wing communities on the internet. So a really big advocate of this is Andrew Tate. Now, unsurprisingly, Andrew Tate is not a particularly empathetic person in that he has raped multiple people and in fact confessed to it in he was talking to his followers in some kind of recording, and he said that he was moving to Romania because they were more lenient in investigating rape there. He's also been involved in human trafficking and abusing women and coercing them into sex work, essentially enslaving them. To use their own terms, so Tristan Tate, Andrew Tate's brother, was found in an audio recording saying that he wanted to slave some bitches. Also, on an online course he offers called War Rooms, a BBC investigation in summer 2023 discovered around 12,000 Telegram pages where Andrew Tate was actually teaching other people to isolate, abuse, and coerce other women into sex work, i.e. enslaving other women. So, not a very nice person. Also, someone has argued that smoking is good for your health and boosts testosterone. It isn't. So in case you're thinking of taking medical or psychiatric advice from Andrew Tate, you might want to think differently. So that's all a discussion on the sort of difficulties of defining mental illness or mental disorders and whether the construct is even real. Now, that's sort of just been an abstract theoretical discussion. Now I want to move on to how do we actually do this in practice. So in practice, in clinical use, how do we deal with this problem of defining mental disorders? And what is a mental disorder? What is mental distress even? So mental distress can be defined from this textbook by this researcher called Crombie and his colleagues as the experiences associated with diagnostic categories and with the work of professions such as clinical psychology, psychiatry, social work, and nursing. So these experiences could be cognitive distortions, for example, thoughts and beliefs which would be normally considered unreasonable, strong emotions, unhelpful or maladaptive behaviors, things like that. So psychology tends to categorize mental distress and mental illness as like this discrete, separate category from mental health. So the idea of you have mental health and then a completely separate category is mental disorders. Now, that's quite a reductionist approach, but there are some benefits of it, and we're going to explore this. So a really big thing in the West, so most Western mental health professionals classify and diagnose different kinds of mental disorders using this big book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. And there's been lots of revisions and different versions of the DSM. The current version of the DSM being used is the DSM-5, or an even newer version is the DSM-5 TR, so DSM-5 text revision. There are some other things as well, for example, the ICD-10, and in fact, if you look at different countries, so China, for example, actually has its own Chinese classification of mental disorders. That's not just cultural chauvinism, the reason why they have that thing. There are cultural differences in how mental disorders and mental illnesses manifest, because again, different cultures have different norms, so different things that they see as normal. So the argument is that if different cultures behave in different ways normally, then mental illness or mental distress, or the idea of acting in unusual or deviant ways, is going to manifest itself differently. Now, as we talked about earlier with the examples of homosexuality and hysteria and kleptomania, that principle can sometimes be applied in unhelpful ways. However, the general principle of deviance from social and cultural norms being a point and cause for mental disorders generally stands. So, for example, Christianity, for example, so atheists argue that Christianity isn't real. However, the belief in God based on faith rather than reason is not a cognitive distortion. It's not an unreasonable thought behavior, because based on the social and cultural norms of the world, that is normal. That's not a deviant thing. So being Christian, despite what some militant atheists online might say, is not in fact a mental illness. But most people in the West use the DSM-5. And the DSM-5 does use this categorical approach. So for each disorder, for example anxiety, it will list various symptoms of that disorder. And it will say, okay, if you have enough of these symptoms, and the number of symptoms you need varies, then you can be classed as having this mental disorder. And then it will give different severities. So the DSM-5 will say, okay, you might have mild anxiety, moderate anxiety, severe anxiety, or extreme anxiety. And that will be characterized by the severity of the symptoms and the duration of the time that you've had them. And that's basically the pattern that DSM uses. So it uses this categorical approach. In that you've got no anxiety, mild, moderate, severe, extreme. Now the categorical approach, it's reductionist, but it is useful in that it gives like a lingua franca to different professionals. So a lingua franca just means a universal language. And it basically means that if you're a clinician and someone else has been diagnosed with depression, you know what that basically means, because they would have been diagnosed with depression from a clinician using the DSM-5. So you can open up that textbook and say, okay, this patient will have 2 or 3 of this list of symptoms, right? So it is useful in that sense. It also facilitates research, because it basically means that you can get lots of different studies which define depression or anxiety or schizophrenia, for example, in the same way, which is really useful, because if they're defining all this stuff in a different way, then it makes it much more difficult to establish a consensus, because you can't really compare different studies because they're all kind of defining the key concept they're investigating as like a different thing. And that's really important in science. So in scientific study, it's not really good enough to base your opinions on just one paper. You want to look at a consensus. This is actually one of the big problems I have with alternative nutrition, like the supplement industry, because they'll take one scientific paper, usually scientific papers funded by pharmaceutical companies trying to sell said supplement, and they'll base their entire philosophy on that, but in reality, it's just not that simple. And arguably, stuff like the DSM-5 provides an explanatory framework for patients. So it basically says, this is like the potential list of symptoms that characterize something like depression, for example. You have 2 of these, and that makes sense to people, right? So it's a reductionist approach. It's not ideal, and different clinicians apply this framework more or less rigidly, but it does have its advantages. But again, there are problems with this. First of all, it uses this categorical and non-dimensional approach, but also a really, really big issue is that DSM-5 and the DSM in general is written by a certain group of people with a certain group of people in mind, i.e. white, generally middle-aged men. Now, this might sound, you might be thinking, oh, he's getting a bit woke, he's trying to push an agenda, he's giving me some liberal agenda. I'm really not, because what I want to point out is that this isn't a political issue. This is just a really basic demographic issue. So the idea of this being written by white middle-aged men, this isn't wokeism. This is just like a really classic problem in science, in that different demographics behave differently, right? That's not some crazy political statement. You know this. This is common sense. But that means that if you're writing a book all about behaviors and normal and abnormal behaviors with certain groups in mind, then it's not really applicable to other groups so much. So that's just a really quite big problem. There's also just some other kind of minor problems with stuff like the DSM. it strongly emphasizes biological differences as being like between people being like the symptoms or the cause of distress. So it focuses a lot on biomarkers of different disorders and biological causes of stuff. And that can be useful, but as we're going to explore later, that's also really reductionist. So when you look at what causes mental illness, it's not just biological factors like hormones and genes and brain stuff. It's also relational stuff, social stuff, wider context. All this stuff genuinely affects your biology as well. So there's a question of, are social factors like relationship harmony, isolation, societal marginalization, are they important because they affect your biology? Are they important dependently? That's quite a big debate. There's not a clear consensus on that. But what is really clear is that mental illness is not just caused by biological factors. It's also caused by the actual life that you have, your life world, one might say, your general social environment, your life is like, basically. And the DSM tends not to really emphasize that, which isn't that useful. And another thing that's a quite potentially big deal is that often with stuff like the DSM or the ICD or all these different taxonomies of mental disorders or all these different manuals that classify mental disorders, is that there's often a high level of comorbidity. So often when people are diagnosed with one disorder, they tend to be diagnosed with another disorder as well. So people who are diagnosed with anxiety tend also, not always, but there's a tendency for them to also show signs of depression. And also, for personality disorders in particular, people tend to be diagnosed with more than one personality disorder. But that raises a really big question. If we need multiple diagnoses to just capture the experience that an individual is having, then are the diagnoses we have even reflecting that underlying experience? Or are there these sort of like weak approximations that we've slapped onto that experience? And we're viewing this underlying psychological experience through the lens of having multiple different diagnoses. But in fact, if we need those multiple different diagnoses, we're not really capturing that experience. So that's another really, really important point. So again, a lot of these problems arise because mental health and mental distress, as I mentioned earlier, can't really be categorized categorically. It's something that we do in clinical practice just because we have to make a distinction somewhere. We have to at some point say, okay, you need to be treated versus you don't need to be treated. Because if we don't do that, like, the actual practice of medicine doesn't really work. There needs to be some kind of point at which you give people access to care or not. So this categorical model tends to be done in practice, but it's flawed because it's reflecting an underlying reality which is continuous, not discrete. So mental health and mental illness, all this stuff like anxiety, depression, even stuff like ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, these are all measuring traits which people show to more or less extents. So an example, autism. A big trait of autism is deficit in cognitive empathy, so an inability to understand how people are feeling. But actually, some people might not be autistic, but they're just not emotionally intelligent and aren't good at picking up how other people are feeling. That's just a normal variable in a human population. Some people are going to be better at cognitive empathy than other people. And obviously autism isn't just cognitive empathy, it's lots of different constructs together. But the point is that all of these constructs, all these traits which together make up a diagnosis or a form of neurodivergence, are themselves continuous in the population. And at some point, we're simply saying that these are pathological, that these are a problem. Also, something like ADHD, things like ADHD, for example, only really become a mental disorder in certain contexts. So for example, the inability to sit still and listen and learn isn't really a problem if you're like a hunter-gatherer or a farmer, for example. So humans evolved to be hunter-gatherers. So the inability to sit down for long periods of time and absorb information that you're not interested in wouldn't really be seen as a mental disorder in a hunter-gatherer society because there's no need for you to actually do that. That's not a thing in which people need to be valued on. But because now with the modern educational system, that is a thing that people are expected to do, people's inability to do that leads to that inability being seen as problematic, being seen as a problem, being seen as a pathology. And hence, in recent decades, especially with the rise of social media and that consequent damage on people's attention spans, especially with the rise of short-form social media, so like Instagram Reels or TikTok Shorts or YouTube Shorts, that's really damaging young people's attention spans. And the result is that in recent decades, there's been a massive rise in ADHD diagnoses. That's for other reasons as well, by the way. That's not the sole reason. But the point is that even the way that we see these continua and these basic variables, even the point at which we say that there is a problem, or if we say there is a problem at all, that's all also dependent on social and cultural context. So these manuals, these stuff like the DSM, the ICD, they're dealing with a lot of complexity. They're having to oversimplify a huge amount of complexity. And so another thing is that personality disorders can be seen as exaggerated versions of adaptive personality traits. So for example, stuff like personality disorder, for example, actually, perhaps I should not say that. Yeah. So there is a sort of greater awareness of this in the field of psychology and the fields of medicine. There's a greater awareness that actually what we see as mental disorder and at what point something becomes a mental disorder is actually kind of arbitrary. And there's a good book about this called The Heartland by Nathan Filer. He actually changed it to this book will change your mind about mental health. That's what he's changed the name of that book to now. It's good. I really recommend reading it. And it talks about this a lot. It talks about how you have this problem when we define mental illness in actual clinical practice. It's quite difficult. And actually, some academics actually oppose the idea of diagnoses as a whole. They say there's no point in giving people diagnoses. That doesn't mean we don't give people treatment, but it just means that labeling people in certain ways, because there's so many problems with it, because it's so difficult to do, it's so dependent on social cultural context, the idea of diagnoses doesn't even make sense. That's not a position you have to agree with, that's just one position available, but I think it's something that's worth talking about, and hopefully, based on what I've told you about the difficulties of doing all this, you can kind of see how that position might come about. So, what causes mental illness? Why are some people seen as mentally ill and some are not? Why are there individual differences in the degree of mental dishealth or mental unhealthiness in a population? So there's basically three groups of factors. There's relational factors, such as the kind of people you're around, your social environment, your early experiences in life and your attachment patterns, and your family and friends and the kind of people you're with, and the amount of trauma that you go through. There's biological factors, such as genes, epigenetics. Epigenetics is just the sort of study of, it's just sort of saying like which genes get switched on or off. So which genes are active, neurotransmitters, brain structure, etc., etc. And social influences, such as social inequalities, stuff like marginalization, being in a social group which has, or some kind of demographic which has a more difficult time of things in a certain society. Again, that's not like a liberal or political or woke or a gender-based thing. That's just, it's almost obvious. So for example, if you're a marginal group, if you're like a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, that's probably going to affect your happiness. That's a basic principle which we can all accept. That's an extreme version of social influences, but it's a thing. So it's a thing that people accept. So biological influences are important. There is actually an old model on mental illness called the biomedical model of mental distress, which basically attributes mental illness purely due to biological causes. That's wrong. That just simply isn't correct. However, biological causes do play a role. So for example, serotonin is a hormone responsible for mood and motivation and sleep. And a way that we treat depression and anxiety is by giving people a class of drugs called SSRIs, which increase the amount of serotonin in their brain, and it's been shown to help people's symptoms. So all the kind of biological stuff is one piece of the puzzle, and it's important. And actually, again, in this podcast I mentioned earlier, so there's another podcast I run called Understanding Happiness, Science and the Buddha. You can find it on Spotify and YouTube. And in these episodes, I talk a lot about the sort of biology of happiness and all the different hormones involved and all the different brain regions involved. So I give a lot more information on that later. But I just want to say that it's not all biological stuff. It is biological stuff, and I talk about that in another video, but to say that it's just biological stuff is reductionist. So an example of this is this study done by this researcher called Eretso and their other group of researchers in 2023, and they compared 17 patients with depression with 20 patients who didn't have depression, so as healthy control groups, and it basically looked at the levels of serotonin in their brains. And that's important because most studies look at levels of serotonin in the blood, and that's not super accurate. And it basically found that people who had depression had a lower level of serotonin compared to the control group. But here's the really important thing. You can't infer causality from that. So that tells you that there's a correlation between depression, depressive symptoms, and levels of serotonin, right? But that doesn't tell you what's causing what. Is the serotonin deficit, I don't know why I'm saying that so really, the serotonin deficit causing depression, or is the depression causing the serotonin deficit? Or is there a third factor that's affecting both depressive symptoms and serotonin levels? And it's true actually, so in this study, they actually gave the patients with depression amphetamines to stimulate serotonin release in their brain, and it led to a release in depressive symptoms. So that might it seems like you're saying, right, so we can infer causality from that. We can say giving people we can infer causality by saying giving people things which increase serotonin in the brain, release them to depression. That's something that we can infer. We can infer causality there. But that still doesn't tell you whether the underlying cause of the depressive symptoms is the low serotonin. So you can't conclude from that causal relationship a different causal relationship of hormone levels and depression. It just means that those two are clearly related. And we know that they're clearly related, but that's just not the only piece of the puzzle. So again, biological differences in mental distress, such as levels of serotonin in the brain. I'm just using serotonin as an example, by the way. There's lots of other stuff involved, such as dopamine, noradrenaline, different regions of the brain, your gut microbiome. That's been a big thing in news articles lately. There's lots of things involved. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the first cause. It doesn't mean that these biological differences in different people's brains, or gut microbiomes or whatever, are what's causing people's differences in mental health. So, because other things such as your social environment and the sort of relationship that you have with other people, that also affects your biology. We're going to get into that more in a moment, but basically, for example, people who are traumatized or who go through experiences of trauma show changes in their brain, so they have biological changes. So we don't really know that the biology is the first cause here. So the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that mental disorder is caused by sort of imbalances in certain hormones in the brain, like serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, that's a really, really big thing in the biomedical model. But actually, when you conduct really, really big, high quality evidence, so the highest quality of evidence in science is a meta-analysis. So not all scientific studies are made equal. And a meta-analysis is the highest quality of evidence because it basically looks at loads and loads and loads of studies, and it looks at all of them, and it finds like an overarching effect. Because often studies will disagree with each other. So a meta-analysis basically pulls for like that overall effect. So it's a really high quality of evidence. And actually, meta-analyses conducted in 2022 by this researcher called Moncrieff and his team, and also another meta-analysis, also by Moncrieff and another researcher called Reed, basically found that there's no evidence that chemical imbalance causes depression. It's correlated with depression, there's clearly a link, but there's no actual evidence that it causes depression. So again, it's reductionist to say that differences in mental health amongst people are caused by biological differences. So we've sort of talked about the biological cause of mental distress. I'm actually, instead of calling them relational, biological, and social, I'm going to call these causes of mental illness social, biological, and societal. So social causes of mental distress are stuff like your attachment style, trauma, abuse, the social environment that you're in, so what the people around you are like, your family, your friendship groups, just kind of relationships that you have with other people. So I'm going to stop calling that relational, I'm going to call that social from now on, which is a bit confusing, but I think it's a more accurate term. So that's not like an official term in the literature, it's just a term that I'm using to refer to it. So attachment style is probably something that you've heard of, and the concept of attachment style is basically that the early relationships that you have, so the kind of relationship that you have with your primary caregiver in the early years of your life, so be those your parents, your adoptive parents, guardians, whatever, it forms not only a blueprint for your relationships later in life, but it also informs your general ability to emotionally regulate and soothe yourself and comfort yourself and develop empathy, etc., etc. And it's basically, there are 4 attachment styles. There's secure attachment, avoidant, there's the avoidant style of attachment, the anxious style of attachment, and the disorganized style of attachment. And the secure attachment style is basically when you have a healthy blueprint for what relationships are meant to be like, and you develop a healthy level of empathy and a healthy ability to emotionally self-regulate. And what's needed for that is consistent love, care, and warmth. That's really important. That's repeatedly stated in the literature. So insecure attachment are basically the other 3 categories of attachment that I just mentioned. So an anxiety attachment style is basically categorized by a fear of abandonment and a really strong sensitivity to rejection and a really strong fear of rejection. And that comes from caregivers which are inconsistent. So caregivers which are sometimes loving, sometimes not. And that, actually I'm going to get into that later. So another secure style of insecure attachment is avoidant style. And the avoidant style is basically being very uncomfortable with emotional closeness. And that comes from emotionally unavailable caregivers. And finally, a disorganized attachment style is a kind of insecure attachment style, which is basically a combination of the two. So you have this fear of abandonment and you have this discomfort with emotional closeness. And insecure attachment styles, if you have an insecure attachment style, you're more likely to experience a mental health issue later in life. And it's just having these negative attachment styles is associated with being less happy and being more likely to get a mental health diagnosis. So trauma as well, early trauma, be it physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, any kind of mental distress, that has a really strong influence on how your brain actually develops. And even in later life, so trauma at any stage of your life actually changes the shape of your brain and the structure of your brain, because your brain is plastic. That doesn't mean it's made of cling film. It just means that it's fluid, it's malleable, it's constantly changing and updating itself. And in fact, if you experience trauma, you're more likely to experience to get a mental health diagnosis later in life. But what's interesting is that different kinds of trauma cause different kinds of responses. So people who are physically abused tend to develop externalizing behavior. So stuff related to impulsivity, aggression, and anger. People who are sexually abused tend to develop a different trauma response. They tend to develop this behavior of dissociation, which is sort of feeling as if you're not in your own body, feeling as if you're just sort of not actually living or inhabiting your own body. You sort of just detach yourself from the actual life that you're living. And it's actually been theorized that these responses might even be adaptive responses. They might even be logical responses to the kind of trauma you face. So for example, if you're raised in an environment and your early environment is very physically abusive, and it actually might be beneficial to be more aggressive and more impulsive and more angry, because that might help you defend yourself. And if your early environment is rampant with sexual abuse, which you can't do anything about, it's been theorized that dissociation is an adaptive mechanism, because it allows you to deal with, when you're experiencing sexual abuse, it allows you to deal with it in a less distressing way. That doesn't mean that these trauma response patterns are good or that they're healthy. It just means that they've evolved in people for certain reasons. And those reasons, it's not necessarily a good thing. Again, evolution is not trying to make you a happy, healthy person. It's just trying to make sure you pass on your genes. But it just follows a certain logic, if that makes sense. So just to talk about how levels of different kinds of trauma affect the actual structure of your brain, there's a really nice paper on this by this researcher called Teicher and his team, so Teicher, in 2016. And it basically shows that, for example, persistent parental verbal abuse in early ages increases the volume in the auditory cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing stress. And also witnessing domestic violence and experiencing childhood sexual abuse also decreases brain volume in different parts of the brain as well. And those are just some examples which he talks about. But there's also, so for example, persistent trauma and persistent stress can increase or kind of change the levels in the brain, increase or decrease volumes in the brain in different areas, such as the hippocampus. So stress decreases the volume of the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain responsible for making memories, and it can increase the volume of your amygdala, which is the part of your brain responsible for generating the fight or flight response. That's an oversimplification. There's actually lots of different parts of the brain that do that, but whatever. And it's also part of the brain responsible for aggression. So again, trauma and abuse at all stages of life, but especially in the early years of your life, really affect how your brain develops and the actual structure of the brain. So it causes these biological changes. So there's also a relationship there's also like some different models on the relationship between personality, which I talked about in episode 31, and mental illness. So one model is the pathoplasty model, which basically says that once you're having certain personality traits, for example, a high impulsivity, will affect the severity of a mental illness if you get it. However, certain personality traits themselves aren't responsible for mental illness. So for example, if you're highly impulsive, it makes your mental illness harder to manage. There's also another model in personality/mental health research called the common cause model, which basically says that whatever root cause makes people develop a certain personality also predisposes people to certain mental illnesses, but the personality and illness aren't directly linked. They're just indirectly linked by this common cause. So that common cause could be genes, for example. However, certain personality traits themselves have been identified as being related to mental illness inherently, or not inherently as in directly, but there are correlations between personality traits and mental illnesses. And I talk about personality and how that's measured in episode 31. But essentially a big meta-analysis by this group of researchers called Kotov et al. So the first author was called Kotov, and it's by this team of researchers in 2010. Basically said that being high in a personality trait called neuroticism, which is basically being more emotionally unstable, less self-assured, more volatile. Being low in a personality trait called conscientiousness, so being relatively disorganized, unpunctual, low in self-discipline perhaps. And being low in extroversion, so being someone who's more retiring, more sober, more reserved. And being high in disinhibition. All these personality traits were revealed in this meta-analysis to be associated with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse disorders. And also in personality disorders, such as psychopathy or narcissism or Machiavellianism, they're correlated with another personality trait called honesty humility, which basically measures people's sincerity, willingness to cheat, willingness to lie, desire to be honest, humbleness, modesty, things like that. I talk about that more in episode 31 of Polymath, so in case you want to check a little bit more about personality research. So, yeah. The final thing that impacts people's mental health is what I referred to earlier as social influences, but what I'm actually going to call societal influences. And that's things like marginalization, discrimination, social inequalities in society, so stuff like gender, ethnicity. Now that might sound politically charged to you. It's actually really quite obvious once you think about it. It really is common sense. So for example, someone in poverty is obviously going to be less happy than someone who's rich as long as other factors in life are controlled. And obviously a discriminated minority, for example, a Jewish person in 1930s in Germany, to use an extreme example, is probably going to be less happy. So all of these things, like mental disorders such as depression and anxiety, so the way that that's diagnosed, as we talked about, are partly based on the symptoms that you show and how long you show those symptoms. And obviously if you're a discriminated against minority, if you're in a very low socioeconomic stratum, you're more likely to show those symptoms, for example. So it is important. Overall, when it comes to mental illness, women are diagnosed more often than men are. That's probably due to both biological and environmental differences. So due to inherent biological differences between the sex of men and the sex of women. I'm going to talk more about what sex and gender actually are in another Polymath episode. It's partly due to that. It's also probably partially due to environmental differences as well. So testosterone actually does have a slightly mental health protective effect. It does actually have an effect on bolstering against things like anxiety and depression. It can also have effects on aggression, but it's a very complicated relationship, and I talk about that more in episode 13 if you want to know how testosterone affects behavior. But testosterone is probably one of the biological factors mediating differences in diagnosis rates between men and women, but it's also most likely to be environmental differences, because women are a group in society which, although in Western societies enjoy legal equality with men, do not enjoy cultural equality with men. And what that means is that the way that women and men are treated in society is in practice really quite different, to the point where women are exposed to substantially more stresses in everyday life than men, and that obviously would naturally lead to higher incidences of mental unhealthiness because they're simply exposed to more stress. So, for example, I talk about this a lot more in episode 29 and about how in systemic sexism and whether it's actually real and how it actually works. But just to sort of put this in sort of everyday terms, even in Western countries where women and men are legally equal, women are much more likely to be sexually harassed. They're much more likely to be subject to everyday sexual harassment. They're much more likely to be stared at in public in a sexual manner than men. They're much more likely to be groped, especially in nightclubs. If you have any female friends or female relatives, I really recommend asking them about this because it's really common. Much more likely to be followed home, much more likely to be hit on by men who get too close to them and make them uncomfortable, and when they turn them down, be insulted or threatened. They're much more likely to, so for example, it's much more dangerous for a woman to walk alone at night or just walk around by herself in general. All these things, again, if I recommend just asking women about just their daily experiences in life to see differences. Just as an anecdote, I know anecdotes aren't very scientific, but what did actually struck me is that a friend of mine who I was talking to recently, she was involved in a martial art called Wing Chun, and she liked to go to a dojo. There was just this one dojo near her which taught Wing Chun, and she really wanted to learn Wing Chun. But every time she went to Wing Chun, she'd wear really baggy trousers, and all the men in her class would tell her to wear leggings because they wanted to see her butt, and that they told her that she was frustrating everyone and annoying everyone by not revealing her body. And in different exercises, which involve, for example, pinning people to the ground, people would often make sexual actions and sexual motions towards her, for example, rubbing their pelvis on hers, when pinning her to the ground in various training drills for Wing Chun. And that is just an anecdote, but it's the kind of experience that I imagine a lot of women can relate to. And if you're a man, I really recommend asking female friends about it. In a wider sense, when it comes to systemic sexism, that's also something I talk about more in episode 29, but the fact is, women do have a harder time in life than men. And actually a study, so there was this really impressive study in 2012, which gave a bunch of female and male university staff identical CVs, but varied whether the name on those CVs was male or female. And university staff who were both male or female were more likely to rated the female CVs as less competent, less likely to get a job. They offered a lower starting salary, and they offered lower levels of mentoring. And what that reflects is a much deeper cultural conception about the role of men and women and what concepts we associate with masculinity or femininity. I'm not going to get into that now for time reasons, but I really do recommend watching episode 29. These same kind of general cultural issues apply to all marginalized groups in society, be they based on race or sexuality, for example. And all these things, the greater exposure to stresses that you have as members of marginalized groups in society, contributes to having a higher incidence of mental health diagnoses because you're exposed to more stresses and more stress. So also expectations of behavior, gender norms about behavior and how men and women are expected to behave also contributes to mental distress. So women, for example, are expected to be demure and passive and non-assertive. That can lead to adverse mental health consequences when feelings are bottled up or resentment isn't expressed properly because it's seen as socially disapprovable to do so in a way that isn't for men. Similarly, the expectation of men to be stoic and unemotional and not talk about their feelings, which is something that's disappearing now, but which was very prevalent in older generations, was also a gender norm which really contributed to mental distress. So again, also with race and ethnicity, there's also been lots of studies on this and different groups of different ethnic groups and how they also show higher incidences of mental health diagnoses in the population. So these two studies by Fern et al. In 2005 and King et al. In 1994 basically give you a lot more detail on how belonging to a BAME, so Black, Asian, minority, ethnic group, increases the risk of mental distress or being diagnosed. Again, due to lots and lots of factors such as a greater increase of stresses and also a lower access to things which buffer mental health, for example, good jobs. So another really, really famous study sent a bunch of CVs to employers and just varied the name between being Anglo-Saxon or African, and CVs with African names were about 45% as likely to get hired. And that really, really matters because something like a good job or employment in general is a really important factor for mental health. And what's also important to bear in mind, again, as I mentioned earlier, stuff like the DSM-5, so these diagnostic manuals, are written with certain racial and gender groups in mind. So they really only apply to certain swathes of the population. So it's also quite difficult to generalize. Socioeconomic status, so your general kind of economic position in society and the prestige of your occupation in society, also has a really important impact on mental health diagnoses and mental health. In fact, so the risk of mental distress increases with having a low income, being unemployed, being homeless, having a parent with a low socioeconomic status. There's been lots and lots of different studies on this and how instances of mental health diagnoses and mental health issues are higher in people with low socioeconomic status. There's also a really famous study in the civil service which showed that people of a low socioeconomic status, because they were more stressed, had a higher rate of cardiovascular disease, despite having lower work burdens than people higher up on that hierarchy. Some stresses are also really strongly related to socioeconomic status, such as eviction, incarceration, etc. You also have fewer resources to deal with those stresses. So therapy is expensive, for example. It's also kind of a fact in societies that people with higher socioeconomic status get better access to medical and psychiatric care, despite the fact that, ironically, they need it less. So all this thing really matters on a national level as well. So when it comes to analyzing mental distress across different countries, once you cross a certain threshold of material wealth, more equal societies do better on basically every measure of mental health. So in a society, once you reach a certain point of material wealth, the bigger the gap between rich people and poor people, the worse that these countries perform on mental health indices and physical health indices, violence, crime, obesity, education, community life, all these kinds of things. Actually, the richest members of highly unequal societies have poorer outcomes, so worse mental health on average, than poorer members of more equal societies. So the UK, for example, is an example of a highly unequal developed society, and it's actually been calculated. A study found that if the UK were as economically equal as Norway, the mental health burden would be more than halved. So we get into politics a lot here because actually different economic systems, so different variants of capitalism, have different views on economic equality and try to tackle it to different extents and regulate it to different extents. And the dominant economic philosophy in the Western world from about the 70s until 2008 was this philosophy called neoliberalism, which I'm going to talk about in another episode, but it's basically one of market deregulation and faith in the free hand of the market. And by deregulating the market, inequality has increased massively to the point where, for example, the average CEO wage is about 250 times the average working class person age in the USA. And in the past few decades, whilst the wages of the top 1% have increased massively in the USA, they've relatively stagnated for the poorer groups of society. So inequality has increased massively. And all of that has really, really big consequences for mental health. So just as a final thing that I want to talk about, just as a sort of integration of all of these different factors which contribute to mental health, so social, biological, and societal, there's this model called the biopsychosocial model, which basically combines all of these things. It was developed by this guy called George Engel in 1977. It was a response to the biomedical model. It was like this new model that was basically saying, no, actually, biomedical factors aren't the only things involved. What's also really relevant are people's psychological processes and social context and societal context. And it basically argues, the whole point of the model is that human systems have both physical, and psychosocial elements. So physical elements such as biological processes, psychosocial elements such as your family, your relationships, your community, and mental distress and mental illness and mental unhealth as a result of the interaction between these two different kinds of systems. So psychosocial factors can influence biological processes from like a sort of top-down pathway, and biological processes can influence psychosocial factors from a bottom-up pathway. So basically, biological processes such as different levels of neurotransmitters or hormones provide a really kind of basic explanation for differences in mental health, and more complex psychological and social factors. So the way that we think, for example, the kind of thought patterns that we have are a bit more sophisticated, so they're more top-down, and the biological stuff is bottom-up, but these two processes interact with each other. And the biopsychosocial model is generally the sort of, I'm reluctant to say best, because that's not a very scientific term, but it's certainly the most encompassing model here. It's really time-consuming and expensive to put into practice. Like if you're a clinician in the NHS and you have 10 minutes to consult a patient, it's really, really difficult to get information about all the different systems involved. So it often means that in practice, in actual clinical practice, these psychosocial factors, so the sort of social factors and societal factors that we talked about earlier, tend to be more afterthoughts. So the biological stuff tend to be considered first and foremost because it's just easiest to get information on. You can just order a blood test or some other kind of physical test and get information on that and treat that with a medication. So that has been today's episode on mental health and what actually is mental health. I hope you found that really useful and informative. A bit longer than previous episodes. I am trying to get into shorter episodes, so I want to make this more accessible. But it's a really big subject, and ultimately, I could remake this as like a 20-minute video, and I probably will. But I also think it's nice to just go through it properly and give all the information needed and do things thoroughly. So I hope that you found that informative, and I wish you all the best. Have a lovely day or night or whatever period of time you're watching this in, and I hope you are, I hope you are very well. I hope you are very well. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you do well in the future. Take care.